Good evening. We are going to go ahead and get started. I am Brooke Clement, Director of the Gerald Ford Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight, and thank you, as always, for your commitment to the Library and Museum, and thanks to the Gerald Ford Foundation for its continued support. Is it not working? Okay. Before we continue, can you please ensure that your cell phones are turned off or are on silent? And while you do that, let me remind you of a few of our upcoming programs and events, as September is going to be another busy month for us here at our library in Ann Arbor. Next Tuesday, the library is going to host Duquesne University President Ken Gormley as he discusses the Nixon Pardon. And here in Grand Rapids, the museum will once again be a venue site for Art Prize, which begins on the 13th. We look forward to hosting more than 30 artists in our space, and we will also be opening a showcase exhibit on September 26th that focuses on Mrs. Ford's battle with breast cancer. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joel Westfall, the Deputy Director here at the museum, to introduce tonight's speakers.
Greetings. How's everybody doing? Great. My name is Joel Westfall, and it is my honor to serve as the Deputy Director of the Gerald Ford Presidential Library and Museum. Let me begin by first going over why we are here tonight with three very important words. The first two are 100 days. 100 days is the time period we normally associate with a new presidential administration. Our view of the importance of these first 100 days goes all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt and his bold actions within his first 100 days to set a new course for the nation in the midst of a Great Depression. And while the 100 days does not define a president's legacy, or their successes or failures within the totality of their administration, a certain attention is paid to that honeymoon period all presidents seem to have gotten, save one, whose days were numbered to 31. And the last word is anniversary. Anniversaries are, by their very nature, a time for reflection. We all have them. Weddings, birthdays, our job, and the end of things, such as a conflict, a truce, a reset. It is during these anniversaries we often get together, like we are here this evening, to reflect upon the past. What happened right, what happened wrong, and how we can use these times to learn from the past. For a wise person once said, "Those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it." Now, let me introduce to you our wonderful guests for this evening. First, our moderator for tonight, Hank Meijer, is the Executive Chairman of Meijer Incorporation in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He joined the family retail business at an age of 11 as a grocery clerk. After serving as a reporter for the Detroit area newspapers, he became editor and later publisher of a weekly newspaper in Plymouth. He rejoined Meijer in 1979 as an assistant advertising director. His very first book, a biography of his grandfather, Hendrik Meijer, appeared in 1985. His second, a biography of Senator Arthur Vandenberg, was published in 2017. Today, Hank is vice chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. He also serves on the executive committee of the Food Marketing Institute and the National Constitution Center. He is a member of the University of Michigan's President's Advisory Group, the Ford School of Public Policy's Board of Advisors, the Henry Ford Board of Directors. He is also a trustee of the Kettering Foundation, and of course, my personal favorite, the honorary chairman of the Greenwich Generation Day Committee. Tonight, we are extremely pleased to have Barry Werth with us. Barry is an award-winning journalist and the acclaimed author of 7 books. His latest book, Prisoner of Lies, chronicles the life and times of Jack Downey, America's longest held captive of war, who spent 21 years in a Chinese prison before returning home. We do have this book for sale tonight in our bookstore, and Barry will be signing that book as well as his 31 days after this event. But I continue. His previous book, The Antidote, provided a groundbreaking close-up of the innovative pharmaceutical company Vertex and the ferocious but indispensable world of pharma that inhabits. His book, Banquet at Delmonico's, was named one of Barnes & Noble's top 10 nonfiction books and one of Amazon's top 10 history books of the year. His previous to that, The Scarlet Professor, won the Lambda Award for biography and the American Library Association's Randy Schiltz Prize for nonfiction. It was also a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award and was named a top 10 book of the year by the Washington Post. The Billion Dollar Molecule, his earlier book about Vertex, was named one of Fortune 75's smartest books we know and a Business Week top 10 book. His articles have appeared in such illustrious places such as The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and GQ, among other many publications. In addition, he has taught journalism and nonfiction and writing at Smith's College, Mount Holyoke College, and Boston University. He currently lives in Northampton, Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming both Henry Meijer and Barry Werth to the stage.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Barry, welcome back to Grand Rapids.
Good to be back.
Delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
Can you hear me all right? Okay, good.
It's all right? It
Um,
does seem a little loud, doesn't it? No? Okay.
We'll modulate our voices as we go along. Barry's epic book, 31 Days, invites an immediate question, Barry. What does 31 days signify?
31 days was the first month of the Ford presidency. Richard Nixon stepped down as president, announced the resignation on August 8th, 1974, just a little over 50 years ago, and Ford pardoned Nixon on September 8th, 1974. Initially, I was interested in writing a book about the pardon. I should say that I took this work on in 2003, 2004, during the first George W. Bush administration. And I quickly came to find that there was much more going on during that month. I spoke with Benton Becker, whose name may be familiar to some of you. He was a young former Justice Department lawyer that Ford pulled in with him as he took over the White House. He was the one who negotiated with Nixon's people for the pardon, and I approached him then, which was only some 30 years after the pardon, and he said, that's an interesting story, but much, much more was going on during that period. And it was really my first introduction to the idea that there was more to that first month than the resignation and the pardon. Those are really bookends to that period. I can go into how much more was going on, but dealing with the aftermath of Watergate was only the first of many, many really critical items that Ford had to get on top of and deal with almost immediately. I was noticing in the museum upstairs that, so I think it may have been Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's and then Ford's Secretary of State, saying that it was the most monumental government crisis constitutional crisis since the Civil War. So the reason I call the book 31 Days and the reason that I laid it out in terms of a day-by-day chronology of what was going on is because so much was happening in such a short and intense period of time that it was really important to see all of these events, not just the pardon, in relation with one another and also in the context of that moment, which was, well, many of us who were still old enough to remember, a confluence of Nixon's resignation after Watergate and the very end of the Vietnam War.
And you had the central figures here. In so many ways, they were old political colleagues, but they couldn't have been more different. Nixon was a loner, lone wolf operator, sort of an enigmatic figure, and Ford was the consummate team player and had been from his youth. And it was the clash between them, the styles of their staffs. I think of you quote Henry Kissinger talking about Nixon, who was a political genius in so many ways, but also such a lonely figure. And that Kissinger quote about imagine if someone had loved him.
Yes, yes. So Nixon was really averse to direct confrontation, which is why he had the White House set up in the way that he did, with an overpowering chief of staff, and then who insulated him from just about everything. And Ford, when he came in, actually didn't want that kind of staff structure. He said, I want to hear from a lot of people. I want to talk with a lot of people. I'll make up my mind myself. I'll be my own chief of staff. But I want to go back just for 1 second to Becker, because when I said, well, what else was going on during that period? He said, well, you had a new president with the former president's staff. And that was something I probably knew, but really didn't give much consideration to. So Ford comes in, and Al Haig, who had been Nixon's chief of staff for the last year or so, suddenly becomes his chief of staff. He's still communicating with Nixon, who's gone to California, and he's got his own concerns about his own potential culpability, because the tape machines in the White House were continuing to run all during this period. So he had his own stake in the outcome of what happened during those 31 days. And that brought another dimension into the story that I hadn't really considered. Ford had his own people around him. He had Phil Buchan, he had Becker, who could run errands for him. But he inherited the same cast of characters that had been inside the Nixon White House at the moment that Nixon resigned.
So Gerald Ford suddenly finds himself as president, and Al Haig is hoping to play a bridge role and a continuing role in that relationship. And it falls to Ford to design a new way to govern.
So Haig knew that his days were numbered. Obviously, Ford was going to want his own person. But in the meantime, he was there with his hands on all the levers, and he was determined to make sure before he left that Nixon was pardoned. So on top of everything else, he was working behind the scenes to complete what he considered to be the transition.
And that's a transition that, of course, takes 31 days. And so as Ford is wrestling with putting together a new team, the pardon is looming in the background.
Always, always. A bit of background about that. So on August 1st, Haig went to Ford, when Ford was vice president, with a list that had been prepared by the White House counsel. And the title was Permutations for the Option of Resignation of President Nixon. And it laid out 8 different ways that Nixon would leave office and know that he would be pardoned for his activities while he was president. Is there something could be adjusted? I'm getting some feedback. That sounds a little better. Can you still hear me? Okay. So one was that Nixon could pardon himself and leave. Another was that Nixon could pardon himself and all of the Watergate associates and leave. And the last proposal on the last permutation on the list was that Nixon could leave and his successor, Gerry Ford, could pardon him. And on the first, when they met, Ford made no commitment. He said, I'll think about this. And then it gets a little fuzzy after that. That night, there was a late night phone call. Ford, in his autobiography, said that Haig had called him. Bob Hartman, who was Ford's closest advisor at that time, told me that no, Ford had called Haig. Now, this is 2 or 3 in the morning. And Ford said to Haig, the country can't stand this. It's too much. Something needs to be done to just cut us off from Watergate. So do whatever you have to do. It was the substance of the conversation. Do whatever you have to do. And when Ford came in the next morning and reported this to Hartman and other of his aides, they were furious because they thought he had essentially made a deal, and they wanted to make very clear that there was no deal. So they made him handwrite a text that he then delivered over the phone to Haig, and it said, I want you to understand that nothing we discussed yesterday afternoon in any way should be interpreted as my giving approval to a pardon. And that testimony became very important later on when people began to raise the question of whether in fact there was a deal. Quite explicitly, there was no mention made of the late night phone call, because as Haig knew and as Ford knew, that if it looked as if there had been a deal, there would have been grave consequences for that. So, but now getting to a week later, when Nixon announces he's stepping down and Ford moves in, he has to contend with this on top of a spiraling international situation, peace talks in the Mideast, the worst inflation we'd had since the Great Depression, and a number of other really critical issues that required his attention. And he began to feel very quickly, largely because the press kept asking him about it, that some pressure to do something to just get Nixon behind him, get Watergate off his desk so that he could deal with the country's problems.
Do we know whether Nixon ever came close to pardoning himself? That earlier permutation?
He had an opinion from one of the White House lawyers that he could do it. And this, again, this came up more recently,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, these are questions that are with us today. But I think Nixon ruled that out. And when he floated this idea that Ford could pardon him, and he got the message back from Haig, Ford saying, do whatever you need to do, Nixon resigned the office believing that A, he would receive a pardon, and B, that he would be able to get all his presidential papers and tapes sent out to him in California so that he could begin to write the history of his own presidency, which ultimately he did, but the tapes and the papers were another matter. And when we'll talk about this a little later, I think, later on in the month when they were discussing the pardon, it was very much connected to who was going to have ownership of the tapes and the presidential papers.
Well, and meanwhile, as the staff situation is evolving, there's another clash, and that's names we associate with Watergate, but then that some of us haven't talked about in years. But Archibald Cox had been a special prosecutor. He was fired by Robert Bork, who was after Elliot Richardson had resigned because he wouldn't fire him. And then Leon Jaworski becomes a special prosecutor. And Cox's team is moving along toward indictments. And Jaworski is now inheriting that team, but with a more cautious approach. What was happening at the Justice Department?
Well, there were so many things going on. You'll remember that 40 of Nixon's associates and aides, not just from the White House, but also from the Committee to Re-elect the President, ultimately were indicted and tried and convicted. So, and the 3 of them, probably the 3 most powerful, his Chief of Staff, Bob Halderman, his Chief Domestic Advisor, John Ehrlichman, and his former Attorney General, John Mitchell, were about to go to trial. And in that proceeding, Nixon had already been identified as an unindicted co-conspirator. So Nixon was facing at least the possibility of immediate criminal charges. And Jaworski did not want to be the prosecutor who brought charges against a former president. I should say, in Jaworski's office, the young prosecutors who really wanted to see Nixon prosecuted alongside his staff referred to this as the monkey problem. And the monkey problem was something has to be done about Nixon. On whose back is the monkey going to land? Now, the prosecutor could have brought charges. Congress was in the middle, even when Nixon left, Congress was still in the middle of impeachment proceedings against Nixon. So they could have done that. There was the Justice Department. There were any number of ways in which Nixon might have been held accountable. And nobody wanted to deal with them. Nobody wanted to be the one to bring criminal charges against a former president. So as the monkey was jumping from place to place in Washington, it became quite clear to Gerry Ford that only he perhaps could simply, with the stroke of a pen, end the turmoil about Watergate. Now, again, this is something we'll talk about in a little bit, but this was not the only way that the situation could be resolved. And everybody knew it, and nobody wanted to take responsibility for it, understandably.
And meanwhile, President Ford, with this hanging over his head, is having to explain and introduce himself to the country. And I was struck, you mentioned in here that he had given 55 press conferences in 8 months in the course of his vice presidential and
Yes.
presidential transition. That seemed utterly unprecedented.
It's so different from today, when months go by before we have a presidential or vice presidential press conference. But it was a different time. The other thing Ford did is he stayed out of Washington as much as possible, because he was hoping to not be involved in this. Now, if you remember, Ford had only been president for about 11 months. Spiro Agnew stepped down. It's interesting because he really was chosen by consensus. The Democratic majority in the House made it very clear to Nixon that only Ford would be acceptable. And Nixon was very aware that the House could bring criminal charges or refer criminal charges against him. So he was very mindful of the House leadership and what they thought. So both the Democrats and the Republicans supported Gerry Ford, but he knew that if he stayed in Washington, he would be dragged into this morass. So many of these press conferences were out in other areas where he was hoping to be asked other questions besides what should happen to President Nixon.
Well, and then when President Nixon resigns, and in the days leading up to his resignation, where President Ford was renowned for being sort of on an even keel, there were serious questions about his health, his temperament, what his reactions would be in the wake of the resignation. And Ford had to wrestle with that too, didn't he?
This is why I thought Becker was so smart in the way that he proposed this to me, because it wasn't a simple, what's to be done about Richard Nixon. There were many other issues that had various touch points to the question of what should happen to Richard Nixon. One was whether or not there should be amnesty for the Vietnam draft evaders and resistors. And a lot of people put these two together and said, well, we're talking about forgiving and forgetting. Maybe these things should be connected. In fact, Bob Haldeman suggested that they should be connected, that the way that Ford might go about this would be give amnesty to the draft resistors and the draft evaders, and at the same time pardon Nixon in an era of forgiveness. So that was one. And then there was the question of the papers and the tapes. It wasn't, very soon after, I think day 2, if I remember correctly, Benton Becker, who was in his early 30s and was simply, as a volunteer, helping Ford get acclimated to the White House, was walking from the old executive office building onto the White House grounds, and he saw soldiers loading boxes onto a truck, and he had already done a survey of the papers and tapes, and he recognized some of the boxes. Haig had promised Nixon that he would get his papers and tape, and he was trying to ship them out to California. And Becker, on his own authority, went over to the soldiers and said, "Stop that. Who gave you authority to do this?" And they said, "Al Haig did." And he marched up to the Oval Office, and he told Ford about it, and Ford was furious, and he hauled in Haig, and so from day 2, the whole history of the Nixon administration was in play, and Ford also had to address that. So, all of these issues started to entangle with one another, and it became a very complex game of chess that Ford had to reckon with. If I pardon Nixon and also support amnesty for some of the draft resistors and evaders, will that create an equation whereby the moves make sense in relation to one another?
And you mentioned the Ford receiving a call from Julie Nixon.
Yes, yes, and that was the other thing. I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent there for a second, but yes, Nixon was quite ill. Nixon had phlebitis, and which is a blood clot, and his doctor was very concerned that the clot in his leg would dislodge and go to his heart and might actually be life-threatening to him. And Ford did receive a call from Julie Nixon saying, you have to do something, you have to do something, my father is dying. So on top of everything else, Ford had the threat that somehow Nixon would die before Ford had an opportunity to do anything to alleviate some of the pain that he was feeling. So pressures were intruding from on all sides. Issues were coalescing around this question, but he did feel a certain sense of urgency because of Nixon's health.
And in the course of that, and a name that a lot of people in this room might recognize, his longtime law partner from Grand Rapids, Phil Buchan, became intimately involved both in thinking about the pardon and in planning the transition.
Yeah, he didn't have very many people in the White House that he was sure he could rely on. I think Buchan was the one he trusted the most, but Buchan had so many other issues to deal with that he couldn't really research the pardon. Now, somebody said at lunch today that in fact some of Buchan's associates from here were looking into the question of whether Ford could even pardon Nixon. But again, it was Becker who Ford assigned to figure out whether he could pardon Nixon and what a pardon actually meant, which was critical. So Becker spent the long weekend in the Supreme Court library investigating the history of pardon authority and came up with a 1915 case, the Burdick case, where the Supreme Court ruled that a pardon was not like a diploma. It was not something that you were going to put up on your wall. A pardon carried an imputation of guilt. So if you accept a pardon, you're accepting that you're guilty. And there's no two ways about it. That's what the court had decided. And when Becker realized that, he thought this would give us a rationale. This would give Gerry Ford a rationale for pardoning Nixon, because he would be implicitly accepting guilt for his Watergate crimes.
And I think what's fascinating is so much of, for a lot of us, we think, was the pardon good or bad? And at the time, it was purely focused on pardon yes or no. But you've raised some interesting questions of it may not be pardon yes or no, it might have been pardon when.
Yes, to me, that was very critical. So getting back to this idea of 31 days, this was 2004 to 2006. It was during the end of the first George W. Bush term and the beginning of the second Bush term. And Dick Cheney was vice president. Don Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense. And we all remember that period differently, I suppose, but in particular, that was the height of the Iraq War and the beginning of the unfolding of that chapter. As I started to look back, I noticed that in every single Watergate chronology, which went on from June 1972, which was the break-in, to the end of this first month, there were events after events after events as the drama built, but that the chronology ended with the same two notations, which was that on August 8th, Nixon resigned on September 8th. Ford pardoned him, and then there was nothing afterwards, nothing. So the question that got me going was, is that how history ends? That we reach a schism or an abruption point where one period ends and another one begins? I didn't really think so. So it was important, I think, to investigate all of this together so that I could clarify how this whole process of the pardon short-circuited the judicial system. So, and I think that's what you were getting at. When Ford pardoned Nixon, he presented it as an act of mercy. A lot of people felt that it was an act of mercy, and that it was critical to putting the Watergate period in the rearview mirror so that Ford could move ahead. But what it did do was it stopped the judicial process from going any further. So Nixon, while 40 of his aides went to prison, Nixon was never tried, he was never convicted, he was never sentenced, he never had to face any of that. And that is a result of the timing. If Ford had waited until Nixon was indicted, and he might have been indicted within a couple of weeks, he then could say, this has reached a judicial stage where I should step in, and now that we know that Nixon has been charged with, I can put an end to this. But because he did it preemptively before Nixon was ever charged with anything, it looked like the last cynical act of the Watergate cover-up. There had been much written and discussed at the time about the cover-up, and here while 40 of Nixon's aides go to prison, the man at the top, the authority who sent them there, gets off scot-free, and it created a two-tiered legal system, which we're now having to still look at today, in large part because of the recent Supreme Court decision about presidential immunity. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I'll try again if I have.
But, well, so for a lot of us and for people who might be Ford partisans, we'd say, well, you know, it cost him his election, but it was a noble act and a necessary act. And the point I think that you help us understand is that maybe if it had been 61 days instead of 31 days, he actually might have been elected in 1976, and the history of the country would have been changed had he waited until the judicial system had played out a little more. So he actually, he didn't need to, he could have performed the pardon without having to have sacrificed his electability.
That was part of the tragedy, I felt, that Jerry Ford was extremely popular during that first month. His approval ratings were at 70%. He was appealing to all segments of the public. People who had been at each other's throats could agree on one thing. Jerry Ford is a breath of fresh air. And when he pardoned Nixon so soon and preemptively, if you look at the pardon document, he pardons Nixon for any crimes he committed or may have committed or may have been contributed to throughout his presidency. It was a blanket pardon. He was saying, you're forgiven for anything you may have done. And it came just a month after Ford was in office. And when it came, most people associated it with all of the previous Watergate disclosures. And it destroyed Jerry Ford's goodwill. As Joel was saying earlier, most presidents have a 100-day honeymoon. The honeymoon was over with Jerry Ford after 31 days. His popularity plummeted. His credibility was now at stake. And had he waited, and we can talk about why he didn't wait, but had he waited until Nixon was indicted, until we could really see what it was exactly that he was being pardoned of, I think there would have been a lot more sympathy for Ford than there was. I should say, Nixon also, he could have helped Ford out a lot. Had he made some statement of contrition, or all he ever admitted to was mistakes and misjudgments and acting wrongly. He never, he never confessed to any of the crimes that all of his underlings and associates had been charged and convicted and sentenced for. So he really skated. He got off scot-free, and had he helped Ford out, that might have balanced things out. But he didn't. He gave no statement of contrition at all, and it was so soon afterwards that people were just shocked by this. I don't know how all of you remember it. I was 22 at the time, and I just thought, man, look at that. You know, we've had 2 years of this scandal, and now Nixon gets to walk. What's more, he gets his papers and tapes so that he can, you know, he can write his own history of his administration. And it just didn't seem right. It didn't. It set up a dual standard between everybody else and the president. It seemed that the president had a kind of immunity that nobody else had, and it fell on Jerry Ford to have to carry the weight of this.
And in your book, you talk about the Washington was a fever of rumor and tips and things. And so Ford is living in that hothouse at the same time that you've got a great quote from a Leonard Garment memo to Al Haig saying, "For President Ford to act on his own now would be strong and admirable, and would be so perceived once the first reaction from the media passed. There would be a national sigh of relief."
Well, it wasn't quite that simple, unfortunately. And if you remember, the White House press corps was very aroused during Watergate. The press felt like it had really brought Nixon down, and it wasn't going to simply walk away from this, what looked like a furtherance of the scandal. So Ford had a wonderful honeymoon with the press for a month. His press secretary, Jerry Terhorst, was from here. He was a reporter for one of the Detroit newspapers before he became the White House press secretary. They had good relations. The press was willing to give Ford the benefit of the doubt. But then on top of everything else, when Ford announced the pardon, Terhorst, who had been cut out of the loop, resigned. And that also set up a problem for Ford, because Ford was saying, I'm doing this because my conscience tells me to, and his close associate and press secretary, who's known him for decades, says, I'm doing this because my conscience tells me to. And it opened the door to a level of criticism, and also gave a permission structure to the press to really go after Jerry Ford. So Ford just did himself a lot of damage by doing this when he did, in the way that he did.
Well, you know, you interviewed Terhorst among so many other people. How did he look back on that?
He regretted doing it, but he felt that he had done the right thing. I mean, for one, as I say, on day 30, he was invited into the Oval Office, and Ford said, listen, tomorrow I'm going to be pardoning Nixon. Can you pull this off? That is, can you get the paperwork out in secret enough so that the story doesn't leak? And can you physically handle the press when this happens? And he didn't think that Ford should have pardoned Nixon, and B, it made his job impossible. So he resigned, and then the way that things used to work in those days is that Time and Newsweek, it wasn't the 24-hour news cycle that we have now. The magazines had to be put to bed a couple of days before they actually came out at the beginning of the week. So it turned out that Terhorst, because he told somebody from Newsweek there's going to be a resignation to go along with the pardon, if you look at the news stories from the day of the pardon, paragraph 1, Ford pardons Nixon. Paragraph 2, high-level Ford administration official quits over the pardon. So there was immediately controversy, which would not have existed otherwise.
You had the Nixon holdovers, of course, were pressing for the pardon, and Terhorst at the other resigning over the pardon. Where did most of Ford's staff and his own team fall on the decision?
The ones who were critical, again, kept saying, Jerry, why now? Why does it have to be now? And his answer was, well, I've already decided I'm going to do it. Why wait? It could be, people are going to ask me, are you going to pardon Nixon? And I know the answer. I am going to pardon him. So why delay? Why obfuscate? I should just tell them the truth. I don't think he was thinking politically. I think he was thinking about some compelling personal urgency he had to A, get this behind him, and B, do what he was going to do because he knew he was going to do it. And had he been more politic, more cautious, if he had just waited until the special prosecutor or Congress or the Justice Department acted on this, he would have had a firmer leg to stand on. But because there was none of that external pressure, it seemed to all have come from inside.
And I have to chuckle because you mentioned here another name from that era was Evel Knievel. And he, of course, was jumping across an abyss, but Ford was doing the same thing, really.
It's so funny the way these things were. It was the same day. The Evel Knievel jumping the Snake River Canyon, the stories came out the same day that and it's interesting because a couple of days before Ford took office was the skywalk at the World Trade Center. Philip Petit walked on the wire between the two, and so this was like a physical embodiment, both times of the moral struggle that Ford was going through. I don't know how history manages to pull these things off, but it does.
I mean, we can't help but reflect, and you mentioned the implications for today. Ford had an opportunity, had the justice system gone further to set a precedent that would have informed how we think about presidential immunity and high crimes and misdemeanors today. We didn't get that, but what parallels do you see, or how do you read today's challenges in light of that?
Well, so Watergate was simmering and then it came to a boil and then it just exploded when in July 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the tapes, the infamous White House tapes, were not covered by executive privilege. Nixon was refusing to hand these over to the prosecutors. And the Supreme Court said, those tapes belong to the American people. They're a product of your office. They're not you don't have no executive privilege. You have no immunity here. You have to hand them over. And as soon as Nixon handed them over, we started to get the fuller story of Watergate. And the Republican leadership of Congress, that's Barry Goldwater, who had been presidential candidate in 1964, and John Rhodes, who was the House Minority Leader and also the Senate Minority Leader. They went to him and they said, you have to go. Your support is eroding by the hour. There's nothing left for you to do. And so the point being, a Supreme Court ruling about presidential power was the thing that ultimately brought Nixon down. Now, there are echoes of this today, of course, with two things come immediately to mind. One was the Supreme Court's ruling about presidential immunity, which said that the president does now have some immunity. I was listening to a report today by an author who just brought out a new book. So part of the Supreme Court ruling was that anything that a president discusses with his attorney general is covered by presidential immunity. And what that means in practice is if former President Ford were reelected and he handpicked attorney general who would do what he wanted to do, he could say to him, investigate Hank Meijer. I want Meijer out of here. And that would be that conversation, which would have, assuming that Hank didn't do anything wrong, would have no basis in fact. It would simply be a presidential preference to do whatever he wanted. But the point is that it would be covered. He would be safe to do that. And it's a terrifying idea that some president should have the power to do that. It's almost extra legal. It is extra legal. But getting back to the other implication is the case about all of the papers that Trump took with him to Mar-a-Lago, and Judge Cannon has now said she's thrown out the case. So for the very thing that Nixon tried to do and was stopped from doing by the Supreme Court, now we have a question of whether Trump was within his rights to take all those boxes and put them in his bathroom in Mar-a-Lago. So we're reliving this again, I think, in part because the pardon short-circuited the judicial process, and we never got to go through a full prosecution of what were numerous crimes for which other people were sent to prison.
I think that's such a critical nuance that you've helped us understand. And I want to leave some time for questions. I'm just one last one, not as profound as the others, but President Ford, Al Haig is that chief of staff as you described. President Ford comes in and he wants to be his own chief of staff.
Yes.
That didn't last long.
No, it didn't last. Haig thought it was ludicrous, but he had this, what he called the spokes on the wheel concept, which was he would be his own chief of staff, and Jerry Terhorst would come in and talk with him about press relations, and Jack Marsh would come in and talk with him about international affairs, and William Seidman, who I think was also from Seidman, is that how? He was from here. He would talk about the economy, and then Ford would make his own decisions. And Ford, it's very interesting. It's almost, I think it's on page 4 of the book, but Nixon announces he's leaving. Ford is still living in Alexandria with Betty. The limousine pulls up and takes him to the White House where he's about to take over as president of the United States. And they hand him a piece of paper that says, you're gonna have to do something about staff. Who do you want to lead the transition? And Ford's sitting in the back of the magazine, the limousine, excuse me, and he writes Rumsfeld. So just, even before he becomes president, he brings Don Rumsfeld into the White House to figure out how to do this. And Rumsfeld also thinks this is a cockamamie idea, that no president can have the time or the facility or anything else, especially in Washington, where everybody's ambitious and everybody's jostling for power and access. But Ford truly believed that he wanted to hear a lot of voices. He wanted to have a lot of conversations, and then he would decide himself. It didn't last very long. It didn't last very long at all.
Well, and it was a remarkable 31 days, and we've got some time for questions here, and we've got some microphones handy if someone would like to start us off.
Yes, sir. It was after the pardon. Yeah, he went to see him. And the other thing to recall is that this was 2 months before the midterm elections in 1974. And Ford was in California campaigning for somebody for a congressional seat, and he went to see Nixon, and Nixon said, "I'm sorry I caused you so much trouble." And Ford said, don't worry, we're going to be fine. And they got thrashed. The Republican, and partly because Ford was now carrying on his shoulders all of the weight of the Watergate scandal, and Republicans couldn't escape it. So that was another consequence of this, where Ford, with his popularity, could have been a great campaigner for all the down ballot candidates. But yes, he did visit him in California, and Nixon, mind you, lived another 12 years, 20 years, 20 years, and wrote a dozen books justifying his presidency. And don't get me wrong, I mean, Nixon did open the way to China, and did on the international front. I think he and Kissinger did a lot that was commendable and that has helped shape subsequent history. But he said, "I'm sorry I caused you so much trouble." Yes, sir. All the others were. I don't know how Nixon would have been an exception. They were all convicted. Nobody was tried for any Watergate crimes and was acquitted. There was plenty of evidence there. It's interesting because one of the arguments back then, and those of you who can remember that, was that the American people couldn't stand to see a president in the dock, that it would be too traumatic somehow for a former president to have to go through a criminal trial. Well, we've just witnessed how that is, and it worked out fine. I mean, you may not be happy with the result, but people were not rioting in the streets because Donald Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts. In fact, there weren't even real protests outside the courthouse. It all, they chose, remember 4 months ago, they were saying, oh, will they be able to choose a jury? Well, they chose a jury. Will the jury be able to act independently and judiciously? They heard all the evidence. They came to their conclusion. So, but I don't know if it was any different back then, but we have seen that the American people have a desire for justice, and they have, they want the truth. And so, yeah, we can, if the president is, acts criminally, I think, would do well to allow the judicial system to work.
So maybe there's a resilience in the body politic that we had to wait 50 years to appreciate.
Maybe, I hope so. I think so. Yes, sir.
Perhaps our expectations of our politicians isn't quite as high as it was at that time today. So perhaps. I probably should know the answer to this, but I don't. What did Ford think of Nixon as a person, as a?
They came into Congress around the same time. I don't know if it was exactly the same year. Was it 46 or?
I think Ford was 48 and Nixon was 46.
Okay, so, and they belonged to something called the Chowder and Marching Society, which were congressional conservatives, conservative Republicans who met. I think he thought that, I don't know how he felt about him personally. I think he admired Nixon. Ford was certainly a team player. As I think we can conclude, he was willing to put the interests of the Nixon administration ahead of his own interests. He did some, when he was a minority leader in Congress, he was happy to do whatever the White House asked him to do. He expressed strong feelings that Nixon could have made things a world easier for him if he had made some sort of statement of contrition. So how did he end up feeling about him in the long run? I think he felt cheated. I think and I'm speculating now, but I think he felt like Nixon, I did a lot for Nixon. Nixon didn't really do anything for me. He left this whole thing on me, and I ended up having to carry it on my own. I don't know if he, even in his autobiography, he does say that he was disappointed that Nixon didn't do more. In terms of a personal friendship, I don't know that Nixon had personal friendships. I mean, Nixon was about Nixon. And if you were, if you did something for Nixon, you were in Nixon's good graces. If you opposed Nixon, you were not. So I don't know any better than that, but it wasn't like they were close friends. And as Hank pointed out earlier, very different types. Nixon really was averse. He was a loner. He was averse to any kind of direct confrontation. Ford was, had an open face and an open heart. And could they have played golf together and enjoyed the time? And Nixon only played golf because it was sort of obligatory, not because he enjoyed it. So,
Jim?
A little bit beyond this, obviously the pardon had a significant part in President Carter defeating President Ford in the election. I think we've observed from here that there is no stronger friendship between two former presidents than President Carter and President Ford. I wonder if they ever discussed the pardon and what, if anything, President Carter would have indicated to President Ford, because I've got to believe that came up.
I have no knowledge of that. I'd be fascinated if anybody did. Yeah, and you're right, Carter tremendously admired Ford, and I don't know, I sort of stopped following the story at a certain point, so I don't know how Ford felt about Carter, but But they were both men of integrity, so they shared that. And in the wake of Watergate, where there was so little integrity, I think that was probably a strong common bond between the two of them. But whether they discussed it or not, I don't know. Yes, sir. Well, he did. First, Ford's first decision was to keep Kissinger. Now, that was controversial in and of itself. Kissinger was responsible for what was then referred to as détente, which was a lessening of tensions with the Soviet Union. He had opened up China, and he was, as everybody recognized, American foreign policy during that period. Ford first came in saying, I'm going to serve as an interim figure. I have no desire to run for president myself in 1976. And at the first available moment, Kissinger said to him, you have to run in 1976, because if you don't, you'll be treated as a lame duck, and nothing that we do will have any real credibility. People have to believe that this is the beginning of a Ford presidency in its own right. And Ford changed his mind. As much as Betty hated the idea, he made it clear within days that he was planning to run again. And then, of course, he chose Rockefeller as his vice president, which was also very controversial, particularly among conservative Republicans who disliked Rockefeller and distrusted Rockefeller. But and then Kissinger had his star was still rising. If you remember from this time, Kissinger was on the cover of Newsweek in a Superman costume. He had done the shuttle diplomacy and brought the first inklings of peace to the Middle East. He had opened up China. His star was, and even as Nixon was struggling with Watergate, Kissinger was able to stay above that to a certain extent. But then with the resignation, it was over. And I don't know that he thought it was over, but all of his enemies in Washington, and there were many, started to go after him because he didn't have the protection that Nixon had afforded him.
Question?
Yes, sir.
How would that set up with the U.S. population at the time, and certainly the Supreme Court, would that have been taxation, and what would the Supreme Court would have thought of itself?
Well, I don't know about the American people. And this was again a theory. I don't know precisely what the Constitution says about this, but there was the theory because the president had pardon authority that he could pardon anybody, including himself. It's a convenient theory, and it's never been tested. So given the way the court was going at the time, that they said that he had no executive privilege covering the tapes, I think they would have scoffed at that and probably have ruled that it was unconstitutional. I don't know that for a fact. And how the public would have accepted it, to me, it's a corrupt idea. You can pardon yourself, really? That, I don't think we want to live in a country where people can pardon themselves. Yes, ma'am. So you people here are more familiar with Betty's history than I am. You must know that Betty was, in 1972, when the Republicans again were in the minority, Gerry Ford began to talk about getting out of government and looking for another job. Because he wasn't going to be elected House Speaker, and that had always been his goal. And Betty was thrilled. She finally thought she was going to get him back. Gerry Ford was such a workhorse. Almost every day during the congressional season, he would finish his work, he'd go to the airport and fly to some remote district and campaign and fundraise on behalf of it. I don't know when she really saw him during that period, but she thought that the world had just opened under her feet when he became vice president and then suddenly became president. As it turned out later, she liked being first lady. People listened to her. She had authority. And what's more, when Jerry was done with work at the end of the day, he'd come upstairs and they could spend time together. And when they traveled in Air Force One and they could be together. So she liked being First Lady, but it was not anything she had ever aspired to. And she did have substance abuse problems. She said she never drank in the White House except for having a glass of wine after dinner with Jerry. And I believe that. I think she was aware of the tremendous responsibility that she had. But, she was very, she didn't want this. And she was very conflicted about it. And then, of course, she was magnificent, rose to the occasion. And, she's very fondly remembered, as she should be. I should say that within a month after the pardon, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and had a mastectomy. So, as if they weren't dealing with enough, there was this too. And I think, I think they were a wonderful couple, and that's been clear.
Time for one more question.
I didn't have the privilege of witnessing a president. And I think about the great divide that in a swing state as a whole. What traits do you think that Gerald Ford upheld to make him such a unifier?
Should you answer that? No, I don't mean, I'm not ducking the question. I think.
No, I mean, I think you saw those traits
Yeah.
and wrote about them in the 31 days. I mean, there was a unifying going on.
There was.
That came to abrupt halt with the pardon.
He was so different from Nixon and carried himself so differently, was, as I said, open-faced and with an open heart, and people trusted him, as, which may seem like an old notion, but, he really was trustworthy. And he did speak with a lot of people, and he did listen to a lot of people, and he was thoughtful. So all of this was great. Unfortunately, he kind of kicked it away by allowing himself to be associated with the Watergate scandals because of the pardon. So that, to me, is you can imagine a whole counterfactual history where he didn't pardon Nixon, and the Republicans did win in the fall, and he went on and got reelected in '76. But that was, that was another one of the abruptions. September 8th, 1974, Jerry Ford made sure that A, he was going to be a drag on his party in the '74 election, and B, it was going to be very difficult for him to win in '76. So, maybe because he was so trusting, I'm not sure, I know, but he was a, to me, the amazing thing about Ford is that he was able and willing to take all this on. I mean, I can't describe to you how torn up the country was at that point. Between Watergate and Vietnam, we were really at a low point. And for somebody who never wanted to be president, didn't run for president, was never elected president, to take that on is nothing but admirable. And he didn't have to do it, I suppose. But by Washington consensus, he was the guy. He was the guy that the country was going to, have after Nixon. And for a month, it was the honeymoon of honeymoons. It was just, people were really starting to feel better about the future after a long period of despair and anger and controversy. And he was that kind of person. His title of his autobiography is A Time to Heal. He was a healer. And that's a wonderful trait. Unfortunately, he got dragged into this morass, and Nixon didn't throw him a life preserver. He kind of left him alone to carry it. And, we talked about the rest of the rest of what happened after that.
He had to wrestle the monkey.
Yeah, he had the monkey on his back, and it stayed there.
And thank you all very much. Barry, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You?
Oh, thank you.
I have something for you. This is a token of appreciation for a wonderful conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Should we?
Let's go another round.
Thanks.
Observations. Is this mic on? No. Yeah, I asked about that earlier. Please turn the mic on. Okay. The button. That helps. No, really appreciate this conversation, and I'll comment on what I think was happening in the conversation in just a moment. But first, I want to point out, well, I'm Gleaves Whitney. I'm the executive director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Proud to serve there. I want to point out that we have members of the Ford family here. Bob Ford, your family. We also have some of our trustees. It's already been pointed out that one of our executive officers is Hank himself. We also have David Hooker. We have other people who are here, Steve Waterbury and others who've served on the foundation. And we have the Friends of Ford here. And we so appreciate and need the Friends of Ford because you get what we do here. You understand the importance, not only of the events that take place, what we were describing earlier today on this dais, but you understand the character of the man behind the events. Did you notice that during the course of this conversation, character came up increasingly? Your question at the end was, I swear I did not, plant that question with you, but it was the perfect question on which to end this evening, the character. If you wanted to explore this quality of character of Gerald Ford further, you don't have to go any further than just through the halls of this museum upstairs. And if you want to see the exhibit upstairs, the new exhibit, the Ford 50 exhibit, I highly commend it to you. Not only will you see the clemency of the Vietnam draft dodgers treated, you'll see the Nixon Pardon, Mayaguez, Operation Baby Lift and New Life, new arrivals, the compassion. You'll see some of the other key events, 6 key events in all, in which President Ford had to make tough decisions to run this country. But I think that the character of the man is what stands out. As I tell visitors to this museum, the character of Gerald Ford is literally written into the walls of this museum. And what did you hear tonight? You heard about his compassion. You heard about his courage, a willingness to sacrifice his own political prospects to do the right thing. You heard about his candor and explaining to the American people and all the press conferences he had to explain to the American people exactly what was going on in his mind and heart and why he did the things he did. These are the qualities that we need today. Are they not? These are the qualities. These are the qualities we see again and again of the visitors of these exhibits who come in and they say, where are our Gerald Fords today? Could a Gerald Ford be elected today? A really important question to ask because we're going to be responsible for creating the conditions in which the Gerald Fords can be cultivated, nurtured, encouraged to run and win elections. I also just want to say that it was mentioned earlier, two wonderful books, actually. Barry is going to be available to sign each of these books. You have the book he talked about tonight, 31 Days. But this other book is just fascinating. Prisoner of Lies, Jack Downey's Cold War. Really highly recommend that you dip into this book as well and read it carefully. For those of you, for example, who know the story of Admiral James Bond Stockdale, an annex of the Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War. Remarkable story. Talk about courage and tenacity, the tenacity to survive when most people would give up on life altogether. Well, Jack Downey has a similar quality during the Korean War and for 21 years? Almost 21 years of incarceration in less than great conditions in China, and then the resilience to come back to this country. That's one of the good things Nixon did. He helped release him, right? I mean, that was part of the story.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we'll say something nice about Nixon before we leave. But he comes back and he has an extraordinary life. So it's not just the part that would be in the Hollywood movie of what was going on in China. All this to say, the Ford is a happening place. We're at the 50th anniversary. He's important to remember. Betty is important to remember at this time, this very needful time in American history. We hope you'll come back. We'll hope you become friends of Ford and continue to support the good work that the museum and the library does and that the foundation does as well. Thank you so much for being here.